Welcome back. We are joined today by Evarist Bartolo, a former foreign minister of Malta, to discuss what is happening with European demographics. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for this. I really enjoy following what you are doing, which is, I think, very, very important. Getting so many different voices that are usually kept out of the mainstream, which is terrible.
Yeah, that was actually my main purpose of doing a podcast is interesting expert voices who are not included if they're not reaching the right conclusions. And today I want to touch on a sensitive topic based on an article you recently wrote. Now, we just saw the release of the U.S. National Security Strategy, and it's quite a shock because, well, it has many components to it. It wants to put an end to NATO expansion. It wants to revive more or less the Monroe Doctrine. It has, a lot of elements to it. But the European aspect is also interesting because Europe is not seen as relevant anymore. And in the U.S. National Security Strategy, it predicts the end of European civilization. That is, that the relative global share of GDP continues to plummet, and which is actually a very real thing, down from 25% to 14%. We see rise of authoritarianism by going after political opposition, free speech, a demographic decline, mass migration, the inability of culture to reproduce itself. But today we were going to tackle one of these problems, and that is the demographic declines. Europeans are simply not having that many babies anymore, and why this matters. And again, you wrote a very interesting article on this topic. I was wondering if you could flesh out your ideas.
Well, the title of my article was Demographic Suicide. Actually, it's a very strong term, which I took from the Schuman Foundation 7 years ago. I am lucky, I think, Len, that in my ministerial role, I went from education to employment to foreign affairs. That kind of responsibility made me look beyond a silo mentality, where we tend to look at different areas of life as isolated and separate from each other. Enough to tell you that as employment minister for 7 years attending the Social Affairs Council in Brussels, we never discussed demography, even though we were discussing the labor force, even we were discussing skills shortages. The only time we discussed demography, because it was related to migration, was when I was as Foreign Affairs Minister, and we discussed migration only as a security issue, again, not having anything to do with the labor force, with employment. Now, this is very serious because the European Union, I think for the last 50 years, it isn't something that has happened yesterday, has been declining in terms of demography. And if we look further ahead, next year, the European Union is bound to reach its peak, but from then onwards, it will start to decline. And it can start to decline dramatically if its population is not replenished with people from outside. Why is this so? Because every EU woman in the if you take the average in the 27 European Union countries is having less than 2 babies, and in most cases having only 1 baby, which means that by 2050 the population will decline by 9%. It doesn't seem too much, but if you understand what those 9% mean, they mean much more when it comes to the working age population. It will decrease by 25 million. The working force in terms of the working age will decrease by 25 million. By the year 21,000, it will decrease by 55 million. And again, we're not just looking at numbers, one has to look at the composition of those numbers. So while the working age population is decreasing by at least 1 million a year, the population over 85% is set to double. So you can imagine what this means. You need more people to work, you need more people to pay tax to be able to afford a social protection system where you will provide care, where you will provide healthcare, not just care for the elderly, especially at a time when you have leaders who are saying, let's dismantle the welfare system because we need to go to a warfare state now, not anymore a welfare state. Once upon a time, I remember being part of a European Union where the European Union boasted of its European model in terms of political, for human rights, democracy, diversity, inclusion, social in terms of sharing wealth, and then environmental protection. But now all that European model has been thrown out of the window, and the new European model is war, war, war. I mean, one doesn't need the document of the US administration to say that the European Union is making itself even more irrelevant. I mean, in terms of the reality of geopolitics, there are a lot of structural factors which show that the European Union's central role has been lost for some time and it was bound to get more irrelevant. But instead of trying to see how to make sense in such a difficult existential situation, it seems as if the present leadership of the European Union is bent on pushing the European Union towards suicide more and more.
Yeah, it's well, one of my major academic interests, lean towards bringing the social aspect into politics because we recognize that politics and economics can't be viewed separately. That's the whole principle of political economy. But the sociology is also very important. Back in the days, there was very common that all of this would come together, but we do it less these days. But something like declining birth numbers. Not only is it over time suicide if we're not reproducing, and but it has economic consequences, political consequences, geopolitical, security, it's social. I mean, if you look towards countries like South Korea, for example, you see that low birth numbers, they also tend to correlate with high suicide numbers because, human beings, we're a social animal. We organize in group, we seek membership in group. And the family is the most important one, where you have benign hierarchies, you have people taking responsibility for the people inside the group instead of just extracting rights for the individual. So it is quite critical. Yet this isn't really, it doesn't really enter the larger political talk much, but that's because we always had rising populations. But now that it's going to plummet, that's why I found your article fascinating because it is something that should be front and center because this will define many of our problems going ahead.
I remember there was I think, a feeble attempt, not in this commission, in the previous commission, to create actually a commissioner to look at demography. But it was a very sort of passing fashion and quite superficial. Because what we must remember, Glenn, is that perhaps some people who might be following us would say, oh, but why think about 2050? It's 25 years' time. And why think about the year 21,000? The demographic decline of the European Union is already here. So we're not talking about the future. It's enough to say that if we look at the employment figures today, the European Union has vacancies of nearly 4 million jobs, 3.9, that it cannot fill because it doesn't have babies who were born 20 years, 25 years ago. So it has to bring them from somewhere. Where is it going to bring them from? From migration. We will discuss migration because it is such a toxic topic. The discussion about it has become so irrational and so polarizing that one doesn't even dare to mention it as a possible alternative to the demographic decline, with all the complications that it entails, obviously. But not only is the demographic decline being felt already now in terms of numbers, but also in terms of skills shortages. The European Employment Agency tracks every month the skill shortages in occupations in the European Union. There are at least 63% of the small and medium enterprises saying that they're not finding the talent which they need to be able to operate. This is not to say to grow, but to operate. And the European Union itself has shortages in about 42 different occupations, mainly in the STEM areas, which is the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It needs 2 million people graduating from universities with those areas. For the present, we're not talking about the future. So when you hear about the European Union being strong, rebuilding its military, having a military industrial complex, not only doesn't it have the young people for the army and young people in the army, in the last survey that was carried out, only 32% are ready to join the army, but it doesn't have the skilled people to have for its own military industrial complex. This is the short sightedness. And as you were saying, when you have countries with this kind of decline in them, people show that they have also lost trust in the future. And one of the reasons why young people do not want to join the army is because they are definitely not inspired by the leaders of today, who instead of giving them prosperity, have given them a very difficult and dangerous in terms of social life, that they are not proud of belonging to an entity which is not looking after them. So this is really deep. We're not talking, I repeat, we're not talking simply about not having the people to work in the jobs that you are creating, but actually a feeling of hopelessness and a feeling of being lost. And that is why it is not just demographic decline, but it's also civilizational decline.
Yeah, I think some politicians like Viktor Orban might be remembered differently than how he's vilified now, because a lot of the ideas about restoring traditional values and only it could be a solution to the excesses of liberalism, which tends to often tear away at traditional institutions like the family, because you do find the research which support the notion that if you put some crosses in a classroom, for example, or encourage the children to attend a Christmas mass or whatever it might be, something that instills religious identity in the population. You will see when people who identify themselves, for example, as Christians, we find that they often marry sooner, they have less divorces, they have more children. Also, as the children grow up, they're also more likely with a father. You see then less antisocial behavior. They finish high school, their kids do not go to jail. They do less drugs and alcohol, less violence. They form their own stable family with higher birth numbers again. So you have this different, call it social engineering, if you will, but ways of encouraging it. But again, not all of these things works. But it is interesting that some politicians are actually speaking about this, because I remember I was at the Hungarian central bank to give a talk there, and they were making. You had the central bank chief coming out, and he was making this speech about, well, what kind of economy do we have? We can't only measure GDP. We have to see what incentivizes the restoration of the big family, for example. These are great ideas, which at some point all European countries will have to have this discussion, it seems.
I think, Glenn, the tragedy is that if we go for the traditional divide of right and left, which I know today doesn't make a lot of sense,
No.
you really have to flesh out what those labels mean. But I think the tragedy has been that the kind of issues that you're talking about, and that people like Orban talk about, And I remember in my first conversation with Lavrov, I was surprised because he was talking to me about the importance of traditional values, the importance of the family. It's important that we don't throw these out. And I was quite sort of surprised that in a discussion between two foreign ministers that this should be brought up. I understand that it makes a lot of sense to bring them up because I think we have to, whatever area we are involved in, whether it's economics, geopolitics, politics, social affairs, we have to deal with it as if people matter. After all, we're doing this not for its own sake, supposedly, but not for our ambition, not for our career, but also, or mainly, it should be for the common good of the people. What I find tragic is to let these issues only as if they are relevant for people like Orban and people like Lavrov. And then, from the other side, when you are all the time crusading about civil rights and that the family is important and talking about as if secularism means that there should be no ethics, that as if liberalism means that you should have no values at all,
Yeah.
then it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense anymore. And especially then, because when we are asking ourselves, okay, so there's demographic decline. It has been going on for 50 years. That even if present governments were to take up policies, I don't know, of providing tax breaks, of giving cash handouts for couples to have more children. First of all, it's not going to happen automatically and from one day to the next. Uh, and we know that we have to deal with the difficult issue of migration, of bringing in people as it has happened over the centuries to make up for this demographic decline. But again, the discussion has become so irrational that it's as if one side used to take the side of the migrants and not care about the feelings of the residents. And the other side takes the side of the residents as if one can do away with migration. And I don't think it is realistic to expect any country not to have to have a measure of sensible migration and migration, which obviously makes sense because migration is a very disruptive force at the same time because the people who come are uprooted and displaced, but in their turn, the people who are receiving them then become also uprooted and displaced. And we haven't been sensitive enough, I feel, as policymakers to take in consideration both sides and to either side with one side or with the other. And this has brought now the European Union to a very difficult situation, very, very difficult situation, because it has demographic decline. At the same time, even today, even the center right and center left parties talk about migration like what they used to refer to and sometimes still refer to as the extreme right. Anti-immigration, not just anti-immigration rhetoric, but also anti-immigration policies. At the same time, if they say, let us enlarge the European Union, because if we bring in 4 or 5 different countries, the population will increase by about 48 million. But those same countries also have demographic decline in them. So they are not an alternative. At the same time, are they ready to bring in those migrants that they need to be able to operate the economy? And at the present moment, the kind of where the debate is going is that is not going to happen. So how is the European Union going to get itself out of this really, really existential, difficult situation?
I think the migration issue is very important because, well, we already see that this can be very divisive. That is, as you said, demographic change is very sensitive issue. That is, but for conservatives, they want to again preserve and reproduce existing structures and preserve existing authorities. So for them, they will always be very cautious about excessive migration because it causes too much disruptions to the national consciousness, if you will. While liberals will always say, well, not always, but often look at the individual on its own. So they're much more open to having more migration. But it doesn't have to be polarizing if it's in moderation.
Exactly.
If you have a population which is reproducing itself and you're introducing some migrants, then culture can reproduce itself within acceptable changes, which happens naturally over time. But what you will see with a plummeting population, which then has to be made up for by mass immigration, even if that mass migration isn't available, it's effectively then becomes a replacement. And we even have this now on the political right. They're talking about deliberate replacement, like a strategy to destroy our civilization. The political or the liberals will then say, no, this is a conspiracy theory. But, this is just polarizing rhetoric. But the point is, the demographic changes are happening too fast. And then, of course, the politicians have to respond to, like, what does this mean? And I see our own politicians suggest that, well, if you've been here, family's been here for hundreds of years, or if you came last year and now you're a citizen, we're all the same citizens. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, if this is all we are, walking, talking people carrying a passport, people who happen to reside in the same place. I mean, this is not how human civilization work. You have sociologists like Robert Putnam who point out that, who's considered himself a liberal, but also recognizes that the less homogeneous societies become, often the less generous they are, the less democratic they are, because the average person on the street, you don't necessarily even want to have economic redistribution because they're not considered to be one of you, one of the in-group. So it is, it's quite, it can be extremely disruptive. But as you said, we're not really allowed to touch this, because as soon as you suggest that maybe huge demographic changes can be disruptive to society, then it's people will get uncomfortable. It sounds like you're straddling into bigotry or
But
something along those lines.
but it is so short-sighted. I can mention some episodes that I've read. Like, for example, you have a small community of about 4,000 people living outside Frankfurt. And then in a few weeks, next to them came a Syrian community of over 40,000. I mean, how can you expect that to be manageable and humanly not to feel completely swamped? So those who are in favor of saying, let them come, and as if somehow or other integration will solve itself and things will fall in place, it doesn't happen. It hasn't happened even with countries like the UK and France, which over the years have also, I think, neglected to really think about how to manage migration and how to manage the social and cultural part of it. Not just simple to have people. um, Migrants are people. They are not just workers, So how do you go about it? If you do not take the necessary educational, social, and cultural initiatives to build these communities, and it's already difficult to build communities which have a similar culture, let alone to bring together diversity and to bring different cultures. I remember, even as education minister, I used to have problems when I was a minister, having um, uh, fathers come to me and telling me, I don't want my daughter to do sex education because that is not according to our culture. I'm talking about people coming from villages in Syria who came to Malta as refugees. I don't want her to do sex education, and I don't want to meet the head of the school because she's a woman. And I used to say, no, 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 no. Now listen, it has taken us years for us to build a culture of equality, that men and women are equal, and that we should have sex education because that it's important even for girls to protect themselves. Now that you are here, you must abide by our culture because it's even in your interest to do that. I used to have the same discussion because we obviously brought in laws, even as education minister, to protect, for example, gay teachers. And the Catholic Archbishop in Malta is bound by that law. And I would always say openly, I expect also the imam to be bound by that law. And cannot tell me, no, listen, this is against our religion or our culture to have a gay teacher at our school. So to build frameworks, legal frameworks, cultural frameworks, where you have so much diversity, you really have to put in a lot of work and not keep on saying integration is letting everyone do whatever they like. I think laissez-faire, laissez-faire multiculturalism is very dangerous. It doesn't work. It creates problems. I remember Glenn having a discussion with the education minister of France after the Charles Hebdo uh, episode in Paris. It was for the first time in 5 years, I think, that in Brussels at the Education Ministry Council we discussed values. It was the first time because it was considered the traditionalists, the Hungarians, the Irish, the Maltese, those want still to discuss values. They are so old-fashioned. Why do they still want to discuss values? We are here, education, to discuss employability, to discuss skills. How are we going to digitalize our education? How are we going to make sure that our people have the skills to work in today's economy? As if society does not exist. As if, how can you have a good labor force if you don't have somehow or other a cohesive social social setup? So I remember telling her, listen, I think please, I know that this might sound hard, but what has happened at Charles Hebdo, this has this has been brought on yourselves, by yourselves, because if because of secularism you cannot have religion and the teaching of ethics in schools because you want your school to be secular, where are these kids learning then their religion? Where are they learning their values? Where are they? This is, it's you can't simply say, in the name of liberalism, let everything happen as it should, let everyone do whatever they like, and things will work out fine. They will not work out fine.
Yeah, well, that's not even secularism. Secularism is dividing religion and state. Dostoevsky, I thought, had some interesting perspectives there because he wanted secularism to the extent that you don't want to mix the church and state because the state will then corrupt the church. This is, you want to bring politics out of the church, but he was also very concerned that the state, that the church is simply given a little corner in society and it should be ignored and almost manage its decline. This is something also very dangerous. I think people forget that with democracy itself, or from the French Revolution, it came with two traditions. The French Revolution introduced nationalism, that is, if you transfer sovereignty from the monarch to the people, then the people had to be defined by a common culture, language, history, traditions, religion. Again, what the nation represents. And at the same time, you have liberalism, which is the right of the individual. Over the time, the liberal nation state is now disappearing because liberalism has divorced itself from the nation state. We're talking not about, we can't have a unifying culture. There has to be multicultural. There can't be a religion in society anymore. You have all these very strange developments, and people don't question whether or not society can actually sustain this. I mean, it is an important question to be asked, though. Is liberalism, can it exist only when it's balanced by nationalism, or should be the goal of liberalism to leave nationalism behind and all of the defining characteristics of one people? It's I think a lot of this, if not philosophical, social questions have to be addressed. Otherwise, you're going to end up with strange solutions. I saw that the university in Guangzhou in China, that they are inventing humanoid robots with artificial wombs, which essentially robots giving birth to human beings, which is sounds like an awful future, and a terrible solution to what should
But
be deep in human nature already, though.
yes, because while we're talking of the demographic suicide of the European Union, let's not forget that by the year 21,000, China will halve its population. It will be just over 660 million, I think. So it is half what it has now. So this issue of demographic decline is global. In some areas, especially like areas like Europe, it's much more felt. And then I think it's much more felt also because what we must remember is that very close to Europe, there's another continent which we tend to forget, which is called Africa. And by the year 21,000, the European Union will have a population of which will be 1/10 that of Africa. Because in the European Union, we will be 420 million, and in Africa, there'll be 4.2 billion. So how is the European Union preparing for this when it has such a continent just a few miles, a few kilometers away from its shores? Again, try to put Africa and the Mediterranean on the agenda of the European Union. Oh, don't waste our time, because we must concentrate on Russia. We must concentrate on the eastern neighborhood. We must pivot to Asia to take on China. And there you are in this reality, very close to you, what is happening within you and what is happening next to you. And it is ignored. These are not the decisions of wise strategic leaders. But unfortunately, those wise strategic leaders are nowhere to be seen. The more I feel that the challenges have become complex, and the more we need deep wisdom to solve them, the less our leadership is up to the task. So the best way to deal with it is war. There's an enemy at the gate. There are the barbarians at the gate. Let's militarize. Let's prepare. Forget all the problems that we have. Yes, our economies are not performing. We don't have enough people for our economies either, where we have created jobs. Let's not talk about these things. Let's concentrate only on one issue. There are the barbarians at the gate. Let's see how we can keep them out. Whereas, in fact, I don't think the people in the European Union are being convinced by that. They're not sure that the barbarians are at the gate, or whether they are the people who are running their countries.
Well, more and more, yeah, the barbarian seems to be our own,
From within.
our own political leadership at some times. But it is interesting, again, well, what does this mean in political terms? That is, as you said, in the 19th century, the European population was 2 to 3 times larger than Africa. Now this will be flipped over. That is, with Africa 2 to 3 times larger than the Europeans. To tell people that this doesn't mean anything, it's not going to affect economics or politics. It's just it just doesn't make any sense. And I think dismissing all this debate as, oh, well, that's just racism if you worry about Africa being so much larger now than Europe. I mean, it will have an impact, and I think it's worth addressing this. Let me though ask. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, Glenn, I was going to tell you that what is really amazing, again, and short-sighted, is that in the meantime, Africa is developing. And you have the presence of Turkey, you have the presence of Russia, you have the presence of China, you have the presence of other countries. So Africa is not waiting for the European Union to move ahead and to develop. Not only, I think, the European Union has been so short-sighted to let itself out of that game, even though it used to be a huge donor to Africa and still gives a lot of money to Africa. But the Africa, I think, will develop not only without the European Union. Because it's developing without the European Union, there's a big chance that it will develop against the European Union. And I think this is so short-sighted.
Yeah, that's what we see now, though. Not just the booming population, but also a lot of the fastest growing economies are now in Africa. And we see, of course, China being the leading economy entering, who has already dominant economic partner in Africa. And just over the past 2-3 years, we've seen so many governments kick out the French more or less and embrace Russia instead. So again, I don't want to build a threat image against China and Russia. If anything, I think we should devote much more time to harmonize interests and actually talk. And yeah, so I don't really have any issues with this. It's just there has to be some recognition that all of this does impact geopolitics, and you have to address exactly what that means and take advantage of the opportunities while mitigating the risks. But I'm not seeing any of this. But I want to ask, though, specifically about economic risks. What do you see of a shrinking workforce? Not just a workforce, but a shrinking population.
Well, first of all, in terms of public expenditure, you're going to have to spend more on healthcare. You're going to spend more on care for the elderly. So you need to build a stronger social protection system. So what does that mean? You need a prosperous economy. Where is the money going to come from to be able to have that social expenditure? So you need a strong economy. How are you going to have a strong economy? If even now, when those statistics that we mentioned about, losing 1 million worker a year, and after 2050, it will accelerate even more. It will double. You will lose practically 2 millions a year if you're not going to replace those. I mean, we've seen Japan trying to robotize. Yes, there are functions that you can robotize, but there is a limit to what you can robotize, especially if we're talking about care for the elderly and in hospitals. It's enough to say that quite a lot of health systems in Europe, including in your country, Glenn, and in my country, without doctors coming from overseas, our system wouldn't be able to operate. So, yes, there are serious implications for economists if they do not have the required numbers, but together with the required numbers, the required skills. So if you're going to have less children going to school, if you're going to have less young people going into schools and into universities, where are your STEM workers going to come from? So people who think that those who deal with demography are conservatives and are belonging to the right wing are being short-sighted. I think the same way that conservatives should not shy away from having sensible, rational discussions about sensible migration, the liberals should also be keeping in mind the implications and the consequences of demographic decline. They will ignore it, at the risk of their countries.
Well, that's the thing. That's the problem with political polarization, because liberals and conservatives, they need each other to balance each other out. That is, if conservatives builds walls to preserve the group while liberals build bridges, you need them to balance each other. In the excess, both of them die essentially, because the liberal will exhaust itself, be unable to reproduce itself, and when a society can't reproduce, a switch goes off in people's head, and they will often have a very nasty backlash. While conservatives, if they close off completely too much, they can also often descend into xenophobia and stagnation, hostility to change. So you do need both, and you need them to balance each other, which is why it's so dangerous when you see this polarization. And polarization happens, though, when problems aren't addressed properly. And economically, I mean, I can just imagine the reduced productivity, as you said, the social welfare, higher healthcare costs, labor shortages, declining consumption, declining innovation, entrepreneurship. I mean, one of these would have quite a dramatic impact, but really the declining population is a independent variable which kind of drives all of this development. How about political risks? Well, what is it that you see?
Well, obviously, the political risk is that while you have, in terms of economics, you have the part of the population which declines fastest is the working age population. When it comes to politics, people over 16 or people over 18 all have the right to vote. And the elderly have become a formidable constituency in politics. So if you, at the same time, while taking care of the elderly, you will have there to deal with the largest number of voters in your country. We are moving to a situation where the vested interests of short-term politics will be to look after the needs of pensioners, to look after the needs of the elderly. At the same time, to be able to do that, you need young people in employment. You need middle-aged people in employment to sustain that social protection. That's why it's such a vicious circle that you cannot disconnect politics from economics. And I think with an electorate which is older, the the risk is, yes, it might be a wiser uh, um, voter, but at the same time, you need to look beyond the need of us. I am one of the elders, so it's in my interest to have a good system that looks after me. But I know that I have a grandchild. I must think of that grandchild. In what world is she going to live? What kind of economy is going to sustain her quality of life? And then what kind of society is she going to live? We must have a bit the foresight to think of this. And this is something which I think is also worrying about the European Union. Glenn, I feel, okay, like a lot of parliamentary systems, short-termism is inbuilt in the electoral cycle, that you don't think of what's going to happen in 25 years' time, but you think, how am I going to be affected if I do this in 2 years' time when there is the general election? So there is short-termism in the parliamentary electoral cycle itself, but more than that, in the European Union, there is embedded short-termism in the structural funds that it said it wanted to spend to be able to compete with China and to compete with Asia. But at the same time, you have to spend this money in 2 years. How can you have a long-term investment strategy to take on the science and technology power that Asia, primarily China, has built, if we were to look at how many graduates are coming out of China in STEM and how many of them are coming out in Europe, there is no comparison. And there is no uh, surprise then that when we look at technology, because obviously STEM is affected also by demographic decline. If you don't have the numbers, you're not even going to have the people in these areas. When you see what's happening in terms of technology, um, I always mention the Australian Social Policy Institute, which tracks the 64 crucial technologies for the 21st century. China is leading in 47 of them, and the European Union in 2 of them. So obviously, all this has implications, not just politically, geopolitically, economically, technologically. It's so important.
Yeah. Well, it's again not just population, but what people are studying, and the STEM sciences are vastly more popular in places like China and Russia as opposed to what we see in Europe these days. But no, it is interesting that while Europe and tends to be among the worst in terms of demographic decline. The main regions would be then India and Africa, which are still producing or growing. It is interesting to see the economic and political changes that this would carry with it. But you mentioned we have to see 25 years into the future. This is more or less takes us back to Trump's new U.S. national security strategy, because it ends up saying that we can't even that Europe in its on current trajectory will be unrecognizable within the next 20 years or less. That's what it says. And to prevent Europe from killing itself with policies and all, which encourages this path, The security strategy even calls for cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory, because it notes that a lot of the leaders which are pushing destructive policies are illegitimate, more or less. They are authoritarian, they suppress political opposition, they censor, and so again, regime change might be coming our way. So I don't think we have to wait 20 years to see
Yeah.
consequence of this. The fact that the United States under this administration sees no future in Europe is also a big part of why it is now making a huge switch. That is, it can't prioritize Europe anymore, which is why the same security strategy suggests the US has to abandon the idea of ongoing NATO expansion and also the focus on Europe. So it's yeah, the consequences are already here, I think. So it would be nice to see at least you know, maybe I don't have all the solutions, or you, but it would be nice to see
My
this issue being
fear,
discussed, though, at least.
yes, exactly. My fear, Glenn, is that there might be the tendency, if I read the situation well, that the present EU leadership will see this as a blip. It's a Trump. When
Yeah.
Trump goes away, then things will be, we will go back to living happily ever after, which I think is very superficial. At least start all the issues that we discussed, Glenn, are very complex. You can't simply have a magical solution to them, which means that then you really need to reflect about them and to discuss about them. But if you are not even going to reflect and discuss them, how are you going to build a strategy for the European Union in such a changed multipolar world where it has to learn humility and to learn to live with others and not to keep on dreaming that you are the center of the world and that you can dictate to others not only what they should do in their relationship with you, but also in their relationship with others. Recently, I was following what the Qatari energy minister was saying regarding the tax that the European Union wants to impose on Qatar because of the green strategy. No, that as gas is considered also a part of the carbon footprint, they have to pay them a tax. The Qatari energy minister said, "But this is very strange, even when it comes to us, because we are selling them gas, but now they want to impose the tax not only on our trade with Europe, but on our trade with the rest of the world." I mean, how can you have the arrogance to impose on other countries what they do, not with you, but, but with their with their countries, with other countries? So unless the European Union really takes a good look at itself and with humility begins to understand what its real standing in the world today is and how to build a future for itself, it's going to get itself into a deeper hole.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. This excessive focus on personalities, I think, is a problem. That is, Trump didn't appear out of nowhere. He's a symptom of larger changes, unique in his own ways. But it's a symptom, though, of the social, economic, and political changes coming. So, if more than anything, I think it's a transitional figure. There's not going to be anything to go back to the past once he steps down. I think we ignore in Europe that there's a whole new political class which is growing in the United States who see global hegemony as a burden, something that destroys the republic, who sees with great concern the rise of this liberal authoritarianism, where this constant reference to values is used to, yes, censor, smear, but also undermine traditional values in society, and also growing portion of United States who, for good reason, thinks that Europe is done economically, socially, politically, and looking at our hapless leadership. Not you, of course, but
And, and, some,
but
and
it is
sometimes
there's something to it, you know.
Sometimes I wonder, Glenn, because of our historical experience as a small country, we've always been a colony. So I think we smell colonialism wherever we see it, and sometimes even where it isn't. So let alone where it is. But I wonder whether what has happened since the World War II the European Union or the European leaders gradually, generation after generation, did not even realize that they were becoming colonies of the United States, and they form part of that sort of culture of dependency, that they are afraid not to keep on depending on the godfather who has kept them and who under whom they have prospered in the last 80 years. And now they are panicking that that godfather ha- doesn't want to keep that kind of relationship anymore. And instead of growing up, they are panicking, and they are behaving in the way that they are now, in the situation of how they want to continue the war in Ukraine, and how they are not really trying to find a solution, when over the last 3 years, 4 years, they have harmed themselves to the extent of cutting themselves off from good a good energy source, to now go to a situation where they have to import a lot of more expensive energy at the same time that this is happening, and that it's making their economy much less competitive. At the same time, they are facing demographic decline, which they are not addressing seriously.
I agree. When J.D. Vance argued that America doesn't need vassals, it needs partners. I thought this was interesting when the master has to tell its slaves, more or less, that they have to grow a spine and start to look after their own interests. This should have been a wake up call. But I think that as the United States shift away from Europe in this multipolar world, the first instinct of the Europeans was, well, we can't let the Americans go. Let's just subordinate ourselves and nod, do whatever we want. Let's line up in front of Trump's desk like good schoolboys, sign any trade agreements he put in front of us. The problem here is if you subordinate yourself, you ignore basic national interest, you become even more irrelevant. And this is what Americans are seeing. They're losing all interest as Europe continues this decline. So I argue that we should do exactly the opposite. That is to, get more Chinese technologies, get Russian energy, connect with other centers of power. We prosper, we gain political autonomy, and perhaps, if the European leaders also grow a spine, then yeah, Washington might actually respect them a little bit. But
Yes, I think if you do not have any self-respect, how can you expect others to respect you? How can you expect them to respect you? And in the case of the European Union, I see that the only viable future forward, is actually to recognize this multipolar world and not allow yourself to be dominated by any great power, but to build relations with all powers and with as many different countries as possible. I like the way Jai Shankar, tries to explain the Indian foreign policy. It's not a matter of being non-aligned; it's a matter of being multi-aligned, and to have relations with as many different countries as possible. I think the old maxim of not to put all your eggs into one basket should be quite a good guiding policy for the European Union to get itself out of the mess that it is in. Not only has it put its eggs in one basket, but it's jumping on them and smashing them to bits.
not putting all your eggs in one basket is essentially the core of geoeconomics as well. Diversify by all means. This is good for you. Well, on the wise comments you just came with in reference to Jai Shankar, this seems like a good place to leave it. So thank you very much for taking the time, and I hope we can
Thank
talk
you.
about this again later.
All the best. Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay.